The crack of bone against flesh shattered the dry afternoon air, and Zelda Vaughn tasted blood as she hit the dusty ground for the third time that hour, her fingers still clutching the deed to her late father's land. "Sign it over, woman," growled Marcus Thornhill, the railroad man who had arrived in Platteville, Colorado 3 weeks prior with his entourage of hired thugs and empty promises. "We are offering you more than this worthless dirt is worth." Zelda spat crimson into the dust, her cheekbone already swelling as she pushed herself up on trembling arms. At 24 years old, she had survived a harsh winter alone after her father's passing, had fought off drought and cattle thieves, had learned to shoot straight and ride hard. She would not surrender the only thing she had left of her family to men who saw her land as nothing more than a route for their iron rails. "This land has been in my family for 18 years, she said, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her skull. "My father died defending it. I will do the same." Thornhill's boot caught her in the ribs and she crumpled, gasping. The world tilted sideways, brown earth and blue sky swapping places as rough hands grabbed her arms. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Thornhill's voice, cold and businesslike. "Break her fingers if you have to. Get that deed signed." The two men holding her laughed, and one reached for her right hand, spreading her fingers flat against a wagon wheel. She struggled, but exhaustion and pain had weakened her. She closed her eyes, bracing for what would come next, when a sharp crack split the air. This time, it was not bone but gunfire. The man holding her hand released her suddenly, stumbling backward with a cry of pain as blood bloomed across his shoulder. The second thug reached for his weapon, but another shot sent his gun spinning from his grip before his fingers even closed around the grip. "That is far enough, gentlemen." The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried an edge of steel that made even Thornhill freeze. Zelda lifted her head, vision swimming, and saw a tall figure approaching through the afternoon heat shimmer. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar beneath a worn hat. His duster coat was road dusty, and twin revolvers hung at his hips, one still smoking. "This does not concern you, stranger," Thornhill said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. The cowboy stopped about 10 feet away, his pale blue eyes moving from the railroad man to his injured thugs to Zelda, still crumpled on the ground. Something flickered across his face when he saw her bloodied condition, something dark and dangerous. "I believe it does," he said softly. "I believe it concerns me greatly when I see 4 grown men beating a woman. Now, I am going to count to 3. If you are all still standing here when I reach 3, I will assume you want to continue this conversation with bullets instead of words." "You know who I am," Thornhill blustered. "I work for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. I have lawyers' connections. You will hang for this." "1," the cowboy said, his hand resting casually on his gun. Thornhill's face reddened. "You cannot possibly 2." The wounded man was already stumbling toward their horses, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His companion hesitated only a moment before following. Thornhill stood his ground, jaw clenched, but when the stranger's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on his weapon, the railroad man took a step back. "This is not over," Thornhill hissed. "This land will be ours. I will return with the sheriff, with federal marshals if necessary." "Then I suppose I will see you when you return," the cowboy said. "Now get." Thornhill turned on his heel and stalked toward his horse, his remaining uninjured thug trailing behind. Within moments, the 4 men were riding back toward town, leaving nothing but dust and blood drops in the dirt. The cowboy holstered his weapon and knelt beside Zelda, his movements careful and measured. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 27 or 28, with a face weathered by sun and wind but striking in its symmetry. A faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, and there was something about his eyes that spoke of long miles traveled and hard lessons learned. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentler now. She nodded, pride making her try to push herself up too quickly. The world spun, and she would have fallen if his hand had not caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Easy," he murmured. "You took some hard hits. Let me help you inside." "I can manage," she started to say, but her legs chose that moment to buckle. He caught her smoothly, one arm supporting her waist. "I am sure you can," he said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only quiet respect. "But you do not have to. Not right now." She wanted to argue, but the pain in her head was making it difficult to think clearly. She let him guide her toward the small ranch house her father had built, its wood silvered by 18 Colorado summers. He moved slowly, matching his pace to hers, and did not speak again until they were inside and he had settled her into her father's old chair. "You have water?" he asked. She gestured toward the pump in the kitchen area. He found a clean cloth and wet it, then returned and knelt before her again. "This might sting," he warned before gently dabbing at the cut on her cheekbone. Zelda studied him as he worked. His hands were calloused but careful, and there was a precision to his movements that spoke of someone accustomed to tending wounds. A scar ran along his right hand, old and white against sun-browned skin. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Preston Jennings," he replied, not looking up from his task. "I was riding through looking for work, saw what was happening from the ridge. You could have kept riding." Now he did look at her, those pale blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I could have," he agreed, "but I did not." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, cleaning the blood from her split lip with careful touches. "My mother owned a small piece of land in Texas," he said finally. "After my father died, men came to take it from her. She fought them alone because I was too young to help, barely 12 years old. By the time I was old enough to understand what had happened, she was gone and the land was gone, and I swore I would never stand by and watch that happen to someone else." The simple honesty in his words struck something deep in Zelda's chest. She had grown so accustomed to people who wanted something from her, whether it was her land or her father's money or simply her absence. Preston Jennings asked for nothing, expected nothing. He had risked his life for a stranger and now tended her wounds as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I am Zelda Vaughn. This is my land. Was my father's before he died last winter. I am sorry for your loss." He sat back on his heels, examining his work. "You should rest. That man, Thornhill, he will come back. I know." She touched her ribs gingerly, feeling where the bruises were already forming. "He has been here 4 times in the past 2 weeks. Each time he gets more aggressive. The railroad wants to run their line straight through my property. They are offering money, but not enough. And even if it were enough, this land is all I have left of my family." Preston stood, moving to the window to look out across her property. The Vaughn Ranch was small by Colorado standards, only about 400 acres, but it was good grazing land with a reliable creek running through it. She could see him taking it all in, calculating. "How many head of cattle do you run?" he asked. 63 last count." "It is not much, but it is enough to keep me fed and the taxes paid." "And you work it alone?" She bristled slightly at the question, hearing the doubt she had heard from so many others. "I manage." He turned back to her, and there was no judgment in his expression. "I am sure you do." "But 4 men came today. Next time, Thornhill might bring 8 or 12, and I will not always be riding past at the right moment." The truth of his words settled over her like a cold blanket. She had been living on borrowed time, she knew that. Sooner or later, Thornhill would bring enough men or enough law or enough money to take what he wanted. "What would you suggest?" she asked, hating the defeat that crept into her voice. Preston was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the window back to her. "I suggest you accept my help," he said. "Let me stay on, work for room and board. I am good with cattle, good with a gun, and I have a feeling you will need both. I cannot pay you." "I did not ask for pay." "Why would you do that?" she demanded. "You do not know me. This is not your fight." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair again, bringing his eyes level with hers. "Maybe I am making it my fight," he said simply. "Maybe I am tired of drifting. Maybe I see a woman who deserves better than being beaten by cowards, and maybe I can help with that." "Does the reason matter so much?" Zelda searched his face for signs of deception, for the hidden agenda that surely must exist. But she saw only steady determination and something else, something that looked almost like loneliness. "You can stay," she said finally. "The bunkhouse is small, but it is weatherproof. I can feed you, at least." A smile touched the corners of his mouth, transforming his serious face into something warmer. "Then we have an agreement." He stood and retrieved his hat from where he had set it on the table. "I will see to my horse and get settled. You should rest. Tomorrow we can talk about securing the property." After he left, Zelda sat in her father's chair, listening to the sounds of Preston moving around outside, tending to his horse, exploring the outbuildings. Pain throbbed through her body with each heartbeat, but beneath it was something else, something unfamiliar. It took her several minutes to recognize it as hope. The next morning, Zelda woke before dawn as she always did, her body protesting every movement. Her face had swollen during the night, and her ribs screamed when she tried to sit up. She gritted her teeth and forced herself upright anyway. Cattle did not care if you were injured. She made it as far as the kitchen before she smelled coffee brewing. Through the window, she could see Preston was already up, checking the fence line near the barn. He moved with an easy competence that came from years of ranch work, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. By the time she had dressed and made it outside, he had coffee waiting and had already fed her horses. He looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral as he took in her bruised face in the morning light. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I was kicked by a horse," she admitted, "but I have felt worse." He poured her coffee from the pot he had brought from the bunkhouse, the simple gesture somehow intimate in the quiet dawn. "I checked your property lines. You have about a mile of fence that needs mending, and that eastern pasture could use some attention. The cattle are scattered pretty far." "I know." She sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "I have been meaning to round them up closer to the house, but there is always something more urgent." "Not anymore," he said. "Today, you rest. I will bring the herd in closer where we can keep an eye on them. If Thornhill comes back, I want them where he cannot spook them or help himself to a few head to make his point." The thought had not even occurred to Zelda, but she realized immediately that he was right. Thornhill would not hesitate to use her cattle against her. "I should help," she started to say. "You should heal," Preston corrected gently. "One day of rest will not kill you, and it might keep you from getting killed when trouble comes calling again." She wanted to argue, but the truth was that even standing here was taking most of her strength. She nodded reluctantly, and something like approval flickered in his eyes. He rode out an hour later, sitting his bay gelding with the ease of someone who had spent more time in a saddle than out of one. Zelda watched from the porch, and despite her intention to rest, she found herself unable to go back inside. Instead, she sat in her father's old rocking chair, her rifle across her lap, and kept watch. Preston worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and even from a distance, Zelda could see the skill in how he handled the cattle. He did not rush them or shout, just moved them steadily and calmly toward the home pasture. By late afternoon, he had gathered most of the herd within sight of the house. He returned as the sun was beginning its descent, his shirt dark with sweat, dust coating his hat and clothes. Zelda had managed to make some beans and cornbread, her injuries protesting every movement but her pride refusing to let her be completely useless. They ate together on the porch as the Colorado sky turned gold and purple. For a while, neither spoke, the silence comfortable in a way that surprised Zelda. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten how it felt to share space with someone without tension or expectation. "You have a good piece of land here," Preston said finally. "Your father chose well." "He said it reminded him of Kentucky where he grew up," Zelda replied. "The way the creek runs through the valley, the cottonwoods. He wanted to build something that would last, something he could pass down. And he did. He passed it to you. Some people in town think a woman has no business running a ranch alone." Preston was quiet for a moment. "Some people think a lot of foolish things," he said. "From what I saw today, you have been doing fine. The cattle are healthy, the land is well managed. You just needed an extra set of hands." "And a faster gun," she added. He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "I will not let them hurt you again, Zelda. I give you my word on that." The way he said her name, with a softness that contrasted with the steel in his promise, made something flutter in her chest. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more. She barely knew this man. But when his eyes met hers, she felt something shift between them, some unspoken understanding that went beyond simple employer and employee. "Why do you drift?" she asked, surprising herself with the personal question. "You clearly know your way around a ranch. You could find steady work anywhere." Preston looked back out at the darkening horizon. "I suppose I have been looking for something," he said slowly. "I just did not know what it was until recently." "And now you do," he turned back to her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe I am starting to." 3 days passed in a pattern of quiet work and growing familiarity. Preston mended fences and tended cattle, always keeping one eye on the road for signs of Thornhill's return. Zelda's bruises began to fade from purple to yellow-green, and the swelling in her face went down enough that she could move without wincing. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and sharing meals in the evening. Preston proved to be a man of few words but deep thoughts, and Zelda found herself opening up to him in ways she had not with anyone since her father's death. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did offer opinions, they were thoughtful and considered. On the 4th evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Preston finally asked the question she had been expecting. "Tell me about your father." Zelda was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Daniel Vaughn was a dreamer," she said finally. "He came west in 1867 with nothing but a wagon and determination. My mother died when I was young, and he raised me alone. He taught me everything he knew about working land and cattle. He used to say that a person's worth was not measured by what they took from the world, but by what they built and what they left behind. He sounds like a good man. He was. When he got sick last winter, he made me promise I would not let anyone take this land, that I would fight for it the way he had fought." Her voice caught slightly. "Some days I wonder if I am keeping that promise or just being stubborn." Preston reached over and covered her hand with his, the touch gentle but grounding. "You are honoring him," he said firmly. "There is nothing stubborn about refusing to let bullies steal what your family built." His hand was warm and calloused against hers, and Zelda found herself acutely aware of every point of contact. She should pull away, she thought. It was too familiar, too intimate. But instead, she turned her hand over, letting her fingers curl around his. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." He squeezed her hand gently. "You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You could be anywhere right now, but you are here, helping me fight a battle that is not yours." "It is mine now," he said, and there was a finality in his voice that made it sound like a vow. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, watching the stars wheel overhead. When Preston finally stood to head to the bunkhouse, Zelda felt the loss of his touch like a physical thing. That night, she lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch and thinking about the man sleeping in her bunkhouse. She had told herself she could not afford distractions, that her only focus had to be keeping her land. But Preston Jennings was proving to be more than a distraction. He was becoming something she had not expected and did not quite know how to name. The confrontation came on the 6th day. Zelda was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard the thunder of approaching horses. She grabbed her rifle and ran outside to find Preston already there, standing in front of the house with his hands resting on his gun belts. A group of 8 men rode into the yard, Thornhill at their head. This time, he had brought not just thugs but a nervous-looking man in a suit who clutched a leather satchel. "Miss Vaughn," Thornhill called out, not dismounting. "I have brought Mr. Patterson here, a lawyer, to help facilitate the legal transfer of your property. We are prepared to offer you $2,000, which is more than generous." "I told you before," Zelda said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My land is not for sale." Thornhill's expression hardened. "I also brought Deputy Marshal Harding." He gestured to a hard-faced man with a badge pinned to his vest. "Your friend here assaulted my men. That is a federal offense." Preston had not moved, but Zelda saw the slight tension in his shoulders. "Your men were beating a defenseless woman," he said calmly. "I am fairly certain that is also an offense." The marshal looked uncomfortable, his eyes moving between Thornhill and Preston. "Now, let us all just calm down here. Mr. Thornhill, you said you had a legal claim to this property." "The railroad has eminent domain," Thornhill said smugly. "We can take this land for the public good. We are simply trying to compensate Miss Vaughn fairly first." "Eminent domain requires a court order," the lawyer Patterson said nervously, "which we do not actually have yet." Thornhill shot him a venomous look. "A technicality." "A fairly important technicality," Preston observed. "Seems to me you are the one breaking the law here, Thornhill, threatening a woman, trespassing on her property, bringing false charges." The marshal cleared his throat. "He has a point." "Mr. Thornhill, unless you have proper documentation, I cannot help you seize this property." "I can get documentation," Thornhill snarled. "I have judges in my pocket from here to Denver." "Maybe," Preston said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, quiet tone Zelda had heard before. "But you do not have them here right now. And right now, you are trespassing. So I am going to count to 3 again, and this time there are 8 of you and 1 of me, so some of you might get lucky. But I promise you, Thornhill, you will not be one of them." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Thornhill's hired guns shifted uneasily, clearly doing the mental calculation of whether their pay was worth testing the cold-eyed cowboy. The marshal held up his hands. "Now, nobody needs to start shooting," he said. "Mr. Thornhill, I suggest we ride back to town and you get that court order sorted out. If you have a legal claim, we will come back with proper papers. If you do not, then this lady has the right to refuse your offer." "This is not over," Thornhill said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I will be back with federal marshals, with army troops if I have to. That railroad is coming through one way or another." "Then I suppose we will see you when you come back," Preston replied. echoing his words from their first encounter. Thornhill wheeled his horse around, and his men followed, the lawyer and marshal trailing behind. As they rode away, Zelda let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking, and the rifle felt suddenly heavy. Preston turned to her, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right?" she nodded, not trusting her voice. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and gently took the rifle from her trembling hands, setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. The embrace shocked her. Preston had been careful to maintain a respectful distance, never touching her beyond that one moment on the porch. But now he held her close, one hand cradling the back of her head, and Zelda found herself clinging to him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. "You are safe," he murmured against her hair. "I have you." She could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong, and gradually her shaking subsided. She should step back, she thought. This was improper. But his arms felt like the safest place she had ever been, and she was tired of always being strong, always being alone. When she finally did pull back, Preston did not release her entirely. His hands moved to her shoulders, and he looked down at her with an expression so tender it made her throat tight. "Zelda," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" He seemed to struggle for words, this man who was always so calm and certain. "When I rode up that ridge 6 days ago and saw what those men were doing to you, something changed. I have drifted for 15 years, never staying anywhere long, never letting myself care about anything or anyone. But watching you fight, seeing your courage, getting to know you these past days." He paused, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. "You make me want to stay. You make me want to build something instead of just wandering." Zelda's heart hammered in her chest. "Preston, I am not asking you for anything," he continued quickly. "I am not trying to take advantage. I just need you to know that when I stand between you and Thornhill, it is not just about right and wrong anymore. It is about you. It is about the fact that somewhere in the last 6 days, I started falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Zelda stared up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she would reject this gift he was offering. Her mind raced, listing all the reasons this was complicated, why she should be cautious. But her heart, her battered and lonely heart, knew only one truth. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. The smile that broke across Preston's face was like sunrise, transforming him into something beautiful. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks with infinite gentleness, mindful of her fading bruises. "May I kiss you?" he asked, and the courtesy of asking, the respect in the question, made her love him even more. "Yes," she breathed. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind, and then his lips met hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. Zelda's eyes fluttered closed, and she rose on her toes, her hands sliding up to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, and she tasted possibility and hope, and a future she had thought forever lost to her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I will keep you safe," he promised. "I will fight for this land and for you for as long as you will have me." "Forever then," Zelda said. "I choose forever." The next weeks passed in a strange combination of tension and joy. Thornhill did not return, but they knew he was out there, plotting and planning. Preston spent his days fortifying the ranch, teaching Zelda new defensive positions, and making sure they had enough ammunition and supplies to withstand a siege if it came to that. But the evenings were theirs. They would sit on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Preston told her about his years of drifting, the towns he had passed through, the jobs he had worked. Zelda shared memories of her father, stories of growing up on this land, dreams of what the ranch could become with hard work and time. They kissed often, stolen moments of sweetness amid the preparation for conflict. Preston was always gentle with her, always respectful, and Zelda found herself falling deeper in love with him with each passing day. He made her laugh with dry observations about her stubborn cattle. He held her when nightmares of Thornhill's beating woke her in the night. He looked at her like she was something precious and rare. One evening, about 3 weeks after Preston's arrival, they were sitting on the porch when he suddenly went still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Zelda followed his gaze and saw dust rising in the distance. "Riders," Preston said quietly. "A lot of them." They moved quickly, both grabbing rifles and taking up positions. As the riders drew closer, Zelda counted at least 20 men. Her stomach dropped. This was it. Thornhill had returned with an army, but as the group approached, she realized something was wrong. These were not Thornhill's hired thugs. These were townsfolk, farmers and ranchers from Platteville and the surrounding area. At their head rode Sheriff Thomas Blake, a grizzled man in his 50s who had always been fair in his dealings. Preston and Zelda exchanged confused glances as the group rode into the yard. Sheriff Blake dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Miss Vaughn, Mr. Jennings," he said, nodding to each of them. "I hope we are not intruding." "Not at all, Sheriff," Zelda said cautiously. "What brings you all out here?" Blake looked uncomfortable. "Well, truth is, word has gotten around about what Thornhill has been doing, about how he beat you, how he is trying to steal your land. And folks in town, well, we have been talking." A weathered rancher named Samuel Morris stepped forward. "We have all heard the railroad's promises before," he said. "They come through, tear up the land, and leave nothing but trouble. What they are doing to you, Miss Vaughn, they will do to all of us eventually." "We wanted you to know you are not alone," added Martha Henderson, who ran the general store in town. "We took up a collection and hired a real lawyer, one from Denver who does not work for the railroad. He is looking into whether Thornhill's claims have any legal standing." Zelda felt tears prick her eyes. She had spent so long fighting alone that she had forgotten what community felt like. "I do not know what to say," she managed. "Say you will keep fighting," Sheriff Blake said, "because we are with you. And if Thornhill comes back with his thugs, he will find more than just you two standing in his way." Preston moved to stand beside Zelda, his hand finding hers. "We appreciate that, Sheriff. More than you know." The group stayed for about an hour, discussing strategy and sharing information. It turned out that Thornhill had tried similar tactics in other towns, usually with success. But this time, the people of Platteville were ready to stand together. After they left, Zelda and Preston remained on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. She leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "You brought them," she said softly. "What do you mean?" "When you stood up to Thornhill, when you showed that one person could make a difference, you inspired them. They came because of you." Preston shook his head. "They came because of you, because you refused to be broken, because your courage made them want to be brave too." Zelda turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I want you to know something," she said. "No matter what happens with Thornhill, with the railroad, with any of it, I am grateful you rode up that ridge. You gave me back more than just my safety. You gave me hope. You gave me love." He kissed her then, long and deep, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I do not have much to offer except a saddle, a horse, and a promise to love you for the rest of my life. But I want to stand beside you, not just as a hired hand, but as your husband. I want to build this ranch with you, raise cattle and children and a life worth living. Marry me, Zelda." Joy exploded in her chest, bright and overwhelming. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, yes, yes. He swept her up, spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her again, and Zelda knew with absolute certainty that this was right. This man, this moment, this love. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Platteville. The whole town turned out, packing the small building to bursting. Zelda wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and Preston wore a new suit that Sheriff Blake had insisted on buying him as a wedding present. As they stood before the minister, exchanging vows, Zelda looked into Preston's eyes and saw her entire future reflected back at her. Whatever challenges came, they would face them together. The challenges came sooner than expected. 3 days after the wedding, Thornhill returned, but this time he brought genuine federal marshals and court documents. The railroad, it seemed, had secured a partial eminent domain order, giving them the right to survey a corridor through her property. Preston and Zelda met with the lawyer the town had hired, a sharp-minded man named Richard Foster. He reviewed the documents carefully, then looked up with a gleam in his eye. "They have a right to survey," he said, "but the order specifies a corridor no wider than 200 feet. And it requires them to pay fair market value for any land actually used. The problem is, they are trying to claim your entire property falls within the corridor, which is clearly false." "So what do we do?" Zelda asked. "We let them survey their 200-foot corridor," Foster said. "And we make sure it is properly documented that they have no claim to the rest of your land. Then we negotiate a fair price for that specific strip. It will not be pleasant having the railroad so close, but you will keep the vast majority of your property." It was not a perfect solution, but it was a workable one. Over the next month, they carefully monitored the railroad's surveyors, making sure they stayed within their legal boundaries. Thornhill fumed and threatened, but with the whole town watching and a skilled lawyer documenting everything, he had no choice but to follow the court order. Finally, a price was negotiated. It was nowhere near the pittance Thornhill had originally offered, but a fair sum that reflected the actual value of the land. The railroad would get its corridor, but the heart of the Vaughn ranch would remain intact. On the day they signed the final papers, Zelda felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was not the outcome her father might have wanted, but it was better than losing everything. And she still had her home, her cattle, and the man she loved beside her. Life settled into a new rhythm. Preston proved to be everything Zelda could have hoped for in a husband. He was a tireless worker, up before dawn and often not stopping until well after dark. But he was also tender and attentive, always making time for her, always showing her through word and deed how much he loved her. They worked side by side, building up the ranch. With the railroad money, they were able to buy more cattle, hire occasional help during busy seasons, and make improvements to the property. The ranch began to thrive in ways it never had before. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, Preston's arm around Zelda, and talk about their dreams. They wanted children someday, a house full of laughter and life. They wanted to see the ranch grow into something their grandchildren would be proud of. They wanted to grow old together, still sitting on this porch, still watching the Colorado sunsets. A year after their wedding, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. Preston's face when she told him was something she knew she would remember forever, shock giving way to joy so pure and complete that it brought tears to his eyes. He dropped to his knees before her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach, and whispered promises to their unborn child. The pregnancy was not easy. Zelda was sick for the first few months, and Preston fussed over her like a mother hen, insisting she rest more and work less. She bore his concern with amused tolerance, knowing it came from love. Their son was born on a clear spring morning in 1886, with Martha Henderson serving as midwife and Preston pacing outside until Martha finally took pity on him and let him in. He held Zelda's hand through the final hours of labor, murmuring encouragement and love. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Preston cut the cord with shaking hands and then cradled his son with a reverence that made Zelda's heart overflow. They named him Daniel, after her father, and from his first breath, he wrapped them both around his tiny fingers. Parenthood transformed them in ways both exhausting and wonderful. Preston proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle even during the long nights when Daniel would not sleep. Zelda watched him walk the floor with their son, singing old trail songs in his rough baritone, and fell in love with him all over again. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, a fierce little thing they named Rose after Preston's mother. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's stubborn determination, and from the moment she could crawl, she was trying to keep up with her older brother. The ranch continued to prosper. They expanded their herd, built a new barn, and even added rooms to the house as their family grew. Preston never lost his watchful edge, always keeping an eye on potential threats, but the years passed peacefully. Thornhill's Railroad was completed in 1887, the trains running through the corridor at the edge of their property. It was strange at first, hearing the whistle and rumble of the locomotives, but Zelda grew accustomed to it. And she had to admit it made getting their cattle to market much easier. Occasionally, she would see Thornhill in town. He never acknowledged her, and she returned the favor. He had moved on to other projects, other towns to bully. She was just grateful he was out of her life. As the years turned, Preston and Zelda built exactly the life they had dreamed of that first night on the porch. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the cattle. Rose was pure wildfire, fearless and independent, already declaring at age 5 that she was going to be a rancher just like her mama. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Zelda up to the ridge where he had first seen her, where he had made the decision to ride down and intervene. They stood together, looking out over the ranch, watching their children play in the yard below. "You ever regret it?" Zelda asked, leaning against him. "Giving up your drifting, settling down?" Preston turned to her, cupping her face in his hands the way he had so many times before. His hair was starting to show silver at the temples, and there were new lines around his eyes, but his love for her burned as bright as ever. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You and these children, this land, this life we have built together, it is everything I never knew I needed. You are my home, Zelda. You always will be." She rose on her toes and kissed him, tasting the truth of his words. Below them, Daniel called out something about one of the calves, and Rose's laughter rang out clear and bright. "We should get back," Zelda said reluctantly. Preston grinned. "The cattle can wait another minute." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Zelda let herself sink into it, into him, into the absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. In his arms on this land, with their children and their future stretching out before them like the endless Colorado sky. When they finally rode back down to the ranch, Daniel and Rose ran to meet them, full of stories and urgent childhood concerns. Preston lifted Rose onto his shoulders while Zelda took Daniel's hand, and together they walked toward the house of family, whole and happy and home. That evening, after the children were asleep, Zelda and Preston returned to their familiar spot on the porch. The stars were coming out, bright against the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "Tell me again," Zelda said softly. "About the day you rode up that ridge." Preston pulled her closer, his lips brushing her temple. "I was just passing through," he began, the story as familiar as a prayer. "Looking for work, looking for nothing in particular. And then I saw you, standing in your yard with your head held high while those men tried to break you. And I knew. I knew that whatever I had been searching for in all those years of wandering, I had just found it." "You saved me," Zelda murmured. "No," Preston corrected gently. "You saved yourself. You were already fighting when I arrived. I just made sure you did not have to fight alone anymore." She tilted her head back to look at him, seeing the love and pride in his eyes. "We saved each other then." "Yes," he agreed, kissing her softly. "We saved each other." 3 more children arrived over the next year's twin boys they named Samuel and James, and finally another daughter, Catherine, who arrived when Zelda was 36 and Preston was 39. Their house was loud and chaotic and full of love, exactly as they had imagined. The ranch grew to over 800 acres as they were able to buy surrounding properties from aging neighbors. Preston proved to have a brilliant mind for business, and under his guidance, the Jennings Ranch became one of the most respected operations in Colorado. Daniel, as expected, took naturally to ranch work and eventually became his father's right hand. Rose, true to her 5-year-old declaration, became a skilled horsewoman and cattle handler, scandalizing some of the more traditional townsfolk but making her parents immensely proud. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together. And Catherine, the baby, had inherited both her mother's stubbornness and her father's steady calm. Preston never forgot the lessons of his difficult childhood, and he made sure all his children knew the value of standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. More than once, Zelda watched him intervene when he saw injustice in town, that same steel in his voice that had saved her life all those years ago. They were not perfect. They argued sometimes, usually about money or how best to manage the ranch. Zelda could be stubborn to the point of pigheadedness, and Preston could be overprotective. But they always talked through their disagreements, and they always went to bed with the argument resolved and love reaffirmed. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that half of Platteville attended. Sheriff Blake, now retired and graying, gave a toast about the day he had ridden out to the ranch with the townspeople, about how proud he was of what Preston and Zelda had built. Martha Henderson, now in her 70s, cornered Zelda at one point in the evening. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling, "when you first came to town with your father all those years ago, I never imagined you would become such a pillar of this community. But you and Preston, you have shown us all what it means to fight for what matters and build something lasting." Zelda hugged the older woman, tears in her eyes. "We could not have done it without this community standing with us." Later, when the guests had gone and the children had fallen asleep in various corners of the house, Preston and Zelda walked out to their porch. Over the years, they had replaced the old boards and added more comfortable chairs, but the view was the same, their land stretching out under the stars, peaceful and prosperous. 25 years, Zelda said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like forever." "Both," Preston said, pulling her into his arms. "It feels like both." They swayed gently, dancing without music the way they had at their wedding and 1,000 times since. Zelda rested her head on Preston's chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For riding down that ridge, for staying, for loving me, for all of it." Preston tilted her chin up, his eyes soft in the starlight. "Thank you for being worth riding toward, for being brave enough to love me back, for giving me a home and a family and a reason to stop drifting." He kissed her, and it was like their first kiss and their 1,000th kiss all at once, familiar and new, comfortable and thrilling. When they broke apart, Zelda smiled up at him. "So," she said teasingly. "Another 25 years," Preston laughed, the sound rich and warm. "At least." "I am planning on forever, remember?" "Forever," Zelda echoed, and it sounded like a promise, like a vow, like the happy ending she had once thought impossible. As they stood together on the porch of the house her father had built, and they had made a home, with their children sleeping safe inside and their land stretching peaceful around them, Zelda thought about that day so long ago when she had refused to give up her land. She had been beaten and bloodied but not broken, and then a stranger had ridden into her life and changed everything. Preston was no longer a stranger. He was her husband, her partner, the father of her children, and the love of her life. Together, they had built something that would last for generations, something that no railroad or greedy businessman or passing time could take away. The years continued to pass in a gentle rhythm of seasons and celebrations. They watched their children grow and marry and start families of their own. Daniel married a sweet schoolteacher from town and brought her to live on the ranch, building a house just over the eastern ridge. Rose shocked everyone by marrying a former cavalry officer and starting her own ranch with him in Wyoming, though she visited often. The twins eventually partnered together to start a horse breeding operation on a corner of the family land. Catherine, the youngest, became a teacher in Platteville, but she never moved far from home. Preston's hair went completely silver, and he developed a limp from an old injury that acted up in cold weather. Zelda's hands became gnarled from years of hard work, and she wore reading glasses for the first time in her life. But when Preston looked at her, she saw herself through his eyes, still beautiful, still strong, still the woman he had chosen to love. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents. The ranch remained in the family, passed from generation to generation, each one adding their own chapter to the story. The original deed, the one Zelda had clutched so desperately that day, was framed and hung in the main house, a reminder of where it all began. On a warm summer evening in 1921, when Zelda was 60 and Preston was 63, they sat together on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Preston had been feeling poorly lately, his heart not as strong as it once was, but on this evening he seemed at peace. "Read to me," he said softly, and Zelda picked up the book they had been working through, a collection of poetry. She read until the sun set and the stars emerged, her voice steady and clear. When she finished and looked over, Preston was watching her with such love that it took her breath away. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you from the moment I saw you standing your ground against those men. I will love you beyond my last breath." "And I love you," Zelda replied, reaching for his hand. "You gave me everything." "No," he said, echoing words from long ago. "We gave each other everything." He squeezed her hand gently, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, at peace with the life they had lived and the love they had shared. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 nights later, with Zelda holding his hand and their children gathered around. The whole town turned out for his funeral, testament to the respect and love he had earned in his decades in Platteville. Zelda grieved deeply, but she did not break. Preston had taught her that strength came not from never falling, but from always rising again. She continued to oversee the ranch with Daniel's help, remained active in the community, and showered her grandchildren and great-grandchildren with love and stories. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch alone, but not truly alone. She could feel Preston there beside her, could hear his voice in the wind and see his love in the faces of their descendants. He had promised her forever, and even death could not break that promise. When Zelda Jennings finally passed away in her sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by family, her last words were, "I am coming, Preston." She was laid to rest beside him on a hillside overlooking their ranch, and the entire town mourned the passing of a remarkable woman. But their story did not end there. It lived on in their descendants who still worked the land, in the town that remembered their courage, in the love story that became legend. The Jennings Ranch remained in the family for generations, a thriving operation that honored the dream of a stubborn woman and the drifter who chose to stay. On the hill where Zelda and Preston were buried, someone planted 2 cottonwood trees that grew and intertwined over the years, their branches reaching for each other, the way the couple once had. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, if you sat very still on the old ranch house porch, you could almost hear them, a woman's laughter and a man's low voice, forever echoing across the land they had fought for and won together. Their great-great-grandchildren still told the story around campfires and dinner tables, how a cowboy rode down from a ridge one day and saved a woman from being beaten, how he stood guard and drove away her enemies, how they fell in love and built an empire from dust and determination, how they proved that courage and love could overcome any obstacle. And in the telling and retelling, the story became more than just history. It became a promise that true love exists, that one person can make a difference, and that some things, family, land, and love, are always worth fighting for. The ranch stood as monument to that truth, passed down through generations, each one adding their own chapter while honoring the foundation that Zelda and Preston had built with blood, sweat, tears, and an unshakable love that death itself could not diminish. Their story was complete, their ending happy, their legacy eternal. And that was exactly as it should be.